Hello, subscribers and others. It's David Hoffman, filmmaker. And this is a clip you're going to see by a comedian done in 1979 in an interview with me talking about the 1950s when he grew up. I'm doing this because so many of my subscribers are interested in the 1950s, either because you lived it, or because you remember it, or because your parents talked about it, or because you're curious, or because you're a millennial who's kind of trying to see, are we advancing? Where are we? Are we worse off than we were back then, or are we better off than we are back then? But there's a great conflict in this 1950s, the baby boomers, and you're seeing it in my comments. There are people who just hate the baby boomers. They destroyed America. It's never going to be the same again because of baby boomers. There are others who are baby boomers who are asking for sympathy, and there are selfish baby boomers and stupid baby boomers. So I want you to take a look at this clip, but before you do, I want to give you a little background. First of all, the time is 1989. Did I say 79 before? If I did, I'm wrong. 1989. And I'm doing a public television series called Making Sense of the 60s about middle class, largely white, largely suburban kids. There had been a great television series on PBS called Eyes on the Prize about the black experience. So my series, Making Sense of the 60s, is about the white experience, even when looking at the black community and what they were dealing with. And so how am I going to do this? Well, I was going to interview 200 ordinary people, largely ordinary, a few extraordinary, a few well-known, but mostly unknown. So I hired some guys and girls. They got on the phone. They started calling thousands of people by asking local newspapers, well, who's interesting in your town? Who's a good talker, etc. And I had these people ask simple questions like, do you like your work? And some people answered, oh, that's a tough question. You're out. Some people said, I'm going to tell you exactly how I feel. They were good. They were likely to be in. And I wanted people from all perspectives, conservative, liberal, rich, poor, handsome, ugly, north, south. And I did it in these 180 interviews. So the interview you're about to see is with Robert Klein. Robert Klein, he grew up in Brooklyn, and he was a pretty much successful guy from the start. He got into the Second City Club, which was a comedy club that traveled the country brilliant. He was a host of The Tonight Show. He did 5, I think, HBO comedy specials. And in the early days of Saturday Night Live, he was one of the hosts. So then he produced a record album, Child of the 50s. People compared him to George Carlin. So I said, this guy's one of the guys. Brooklyn, New York, successful, outrageous. What do you think about the 1950s and how did you grow up? And here's what he said. Now I'm running the whole clip without editing out questions because subscribers have said to me, hey David, in some cases, just run the whole thing. Don't make any cuts. Okay, we'll see how that goes. You tell me what you think. I'm hopeful that this enhances your awareness of the 1950s, of the baby boomers, good and bad. I'm not making a lot of judgments about it, although I do agree with millennials. Some fairly high percentage of what was done screwed things up. I hope they get better.
When you were growing up in the 50s, when you were growing up, what was the atmosphere like? Do you remember what it felt like to be a kid in the 50s? How would you describe it to a kid today?
Being a kid in the 50s shared something with every other era too. That is, they couldn't wait to grow up. You had no say in your own destiny. I mean, it was in the hands of others. I would say the thing that made growing up in the 50s a different experience than any other era is that we were the first to have the threat of complete annihilation in a millisecond. We were given details in school about how far you had to be from the ground zero and what would happen, you know. They always presumed that the Soviets would have incredibly good aim and that 42nd Street in Times Square would be the target. So that, up to about the Triborough Bridge, you were a memory, you know, it was specks of dust. Up into Westchester, you know, your shadow would appear on a wall where you were, you know. And then farther back, it would take maybe several hours before you died, until you got up to about Armonk, I don't know, north of the city. Maybe your hair would fall out in a few days and you'd suffer for a number of hours and then it would be all over. You were safe if you were in Bali. That is, for a few months until the cloud floated and destroyed you. There was virtually no hope. In addition to this, we came out of an era, I of course don't remember World War II as a contemporary observer because I was born in 1942. We were victorious, we were righteous, and we were alone standing in the world at the end of the Second World War and into the era of the Cold War as until the Cold War really took hold, as the only power. That is, we had the world's fate in our hands. This, of course, by the time I began to grow up in the 50s, became untrue. We were impotent because the Soviets had the same weapons and the same means of delivering them as we did. And they were evil and we were good. And here we are again, 5 years later, back into the same soup, fighting a massive enemy, except that the stakes were all much higher. We saw pictures of kids in the London Blitz. It must have been terrifying, but at least it was a terror that could be grasped and somehow visualized. That is, bombs and destruction, and you better watch your head and get underground. But this was, and it's over. I think that, I don't know if one had to do with the other, but it was as if everyone had calmed down, that the soldiers had come back, and now we're looking for the furthest thing from war, family values. The repressive part, I think, came, there was a kind of little resurgence of Victorianism or something. They're showing these training films now as camp on various cable networks or maybe MTV and so forth. Dating, you know, the film was always bad. Dating can be an enjoyable experience if you follow these simple rules. You know, let your date in the door first, those kinds of things. And I guess we thought that was the way to do it. Must follow these rules. I had a bit years ago about dancing close to Johnny Mathis records and getting so excited and having, you respect me? Yes, I respect you. You know, that syndrome. This extended right on into the 60s. I suppose by the time I graduated from college that most of the women seniors in college probably graduated most without their virginity. But it was still something. Someone's virginity. When's the last time you heard that? Except in the Virginia gubernatorial election, you know.
Well, let me ask you about school. Your remembrances of school, because what happened in the 50s, it seems to us, is that school took over as the parents. You know, the parents were working, they had the job, they had the American dream. What was your school experience like? Do you remember what your relationship to your teachers were? You know, did they take over? Were they the authority figure?
Basically, while I got a good education, I remember school as great drudgery. I'm not sure that isn't universal to all eras, but the New York City Board of Education was chock full of these kind of child-hating spinsters who went to normal school for 2 years, took religion and first aid, graduated in 1899 with chignons and old lady shoes, like Miss Grundy from Archie Comics. And corporal punishment was no longer allowed in schools. You could not hit a child, technically. It didn't say anything about the push-probe method. Hello, Robert, are you going to do that again? As long as you know, they could tug on flesh and pretty much rip it from its mooring. As long as it didn't hit you, this was the technicality. They were untouchable. They were, to see them outside of school hours was a revelation. Much like, I think it would best be symbolized by the fire drill. Fire drill was a great treat. It was a break up from the school routine. And children have a tendency to think that on school hours, the rest of the world ceases to function. So you're out on the street at 10 after 2. And you go, look at that, a lady. Look, a car. I thought they came out at 3. I mean, your day shut off. It was strict. There were certain elements that were good. Pure drudgery, memory. See, I don't believe that a date of history is so important. It's only important if you go beyond the date to why it's important to know that, which I think has been lost now. But it was black and white. Good, bad. We were good. Everyone else is bad. We were virtuous. You know, in many ways, there was some truth to that. We had fought, we seemed to be idealistic. We seemed to be the most altruistic country that ever existed, the most gracious victors in history. We poured millions and millions into the reconstruction of our enemies and got BMWs and Toyotas back, you know. It is ironic that the victors, like the British, you know, making motorcycles that can't start and cars with the hood up on the side with people. Thumb kits, you know, so you can hold up a thumb and get a lift. I think that we were an overwhelming feeling that I heard as a child, and I didn't quite understand, was communists. My mother was invited to a luncheon once in Peekskill, New York, when I was about 8 years old, or 9. Take cover!
Start that again.
Well, actually, we have to wait for this noise.
Yeah.
How was communism presented to you as young people?
Well, we were taught the part that we could not conceptualize at too young an age was the idea of the community owning everything. And they certainly were light on the idealistic aspects of communism, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, and heavy on the totalitarian aspects. In retrospect, that wasn't unfair either, because apologists for communism always said, but this is not the real communism. Well, you know, that's going to happen somewhere in some abstract way, the perfect communism. But I remember my mother was invited to a luncheon, and she was reasonably apolitical, but she caught on fairly quickly. And she was terrified afterwards that she went to this. They were communists, you know. And then I remember the arrest and trial and ultimate execution of the Rosenbergs, having arguments, passionate arguments, with friends at school. My parents, in addition to being Americans, were Jewish, of course, and were very much ashamed. That's all we need, right? Things were bad for the Jews. Oh no, these people. And I remember people arguing in school from more progressive families just as passionately the other way, that these people either did nothing wrong or whether they did something wrong or not was irrelevant. They should not have been executed. So it was, I remember my cousin, a real siren. She was going with a saxophone player, and he gave her a Valentine's gift. And he said, it's really not much, but what else can a poor communist afford? There went that relationship, you know. And I remember I had met the guy, he seemed pretty cool to me. And then suddenly, I heard the Internationale, you know, that's it. They were evil. That there was, I could find no justification for them believing that way. Of course, there were all kinds of justifications for them to believing that way, which really began in the Depression. And it can't be denied that the communists were in the vanguard against the fascists. You have to take one enemy at a time, you know? And we had been, after all, allies of the communists.
Can you tell me the story about when in school, the famous air raid drills that you would have in school? Once again, for a kid, remember, these kids watching this who don't understand it, they've never been through something like that.
Should I tell them
Yeah,
about
it? What time have we got?
We're at 13.
Good.
We, of course, had fire drills like any other school group. We had to teach children how to get out of the building and what to do in case of an emergency like that. But we had the the added thrill of the take cover drills and the nuclear Holocaust drills. First of all, each of us were dispensed a dog tag, which we were told by this old teacher, somewhat tactlessly, could withstand the heat of 1,000 degrees centigrade, made not to melt. Unfortunately, our skin disintegrated about 900 degrees before, but we had the comfort of knowing we could be identified in the event we were burned beyond recognition in a nuclear Holocaust. She actually put it that way. Had my name, I think it's Klein, Robert, Heeb, something, you know. And there were two kinds. One, if you got ample warning that the Soviets were somewhere over the Antilles. I don't know where that is, but it sounds like a good place for you. When they were some distance away and we had plenty of time. That is, we would get into the halls, line up along the side of the walls, cover our heads with our coats. Then there was a little more serious drill when the enemy was around 98th Street and Park Avenue. I mean, when you could hear the whistle of the thing coming, and there was no warning. And the way they would do this is a monitor would come and turns out to have a thing for the teacher. When this monitor leaves, conduct a surprise take cover drill. And, you know, she'd give it away, look at the class, sign it, and leave. Anyway, children, we were talking about Thomas Jefferson. Take cover! We were instructed to go under the desk, put your backside to the window. For some reason, that was less valuable to lose than your brain. And I don't remember if you put your hands over your head or not, but of course, they never bothered to change the monitor. So it got, after a while, very boring. The monitor would come in, everyone would slowly get under their desk before the teacher signed it, you know. There was involved in this a system of sirens, and the 2 short blasts, one followed by 1 loud blast is, you know, take cover. 4 short blasts and 1 loud blast, followed by 3 short blasts, all clear. I mean, you could confuse these and walk out in an all clear and get disintegrated. Also, they foolishly blew a siren every day at 12 o'clock. And it drove me crazy, walking home for lunch, and, it's 12 o'clock, you know, I mean, and it always occurred to me that the Soviets could attack at 12 o'clock. We'd think it's lunch, and we were all gone. You know, it's bye-bye, baby. So it's funny that I had some dreams about it and thought about it. Also, there was a law which prohibited sirens on television programs. If you were watching Abbott and Costello, and there was a chase with an ambulance, hey, Abbott! And the siren started to go off for the ambulance, the sound would cut off on television. All stations were required to, just so it wouldn't confuse people. I think that it had a more subtle and momentous meaning of terror, that it invaded dreams. You took it for granted after a while, like you take everything for granted, like you really didn't think it would happen. You know, we have all kinds of protection. After all, we'll do it to them. That was the truce of terror. Eisenhower called it, I've forgotten exactly how he articulated it, but it's true. It held up for many, many years. They knew they'd get it back and therefore didn't do it. But it was, I think, wearing. And it's interesting when you think about it that our upbringing was strict and by the rules, and you didn't break those rules. That was to come later, the rebellion, not surprisingly. But at a time when we could all be obliterated in an instant, it seemed that maybe it should have happened then, you know.
Idea of juvenile delinquents. Do you remember this concept of juvenile delinquency? And did you know any juvenile delinquents? Were they people around you? Were you a juvenile delinquent?
I knew of the concept of juvenile delinquency. I was not a juvenile delinquent, no. I knew some juvenile delinquents. As a matter of fact, I went to a junior high school where, I mean, basically the greatest crime was talking too much, you know, fooling around, real crimes. Yeah, you know, it's as if, it's funny, I don't know where that name came from. It must be a post-war progressive psychological term. as if it was some affliction. It wasn't. I think it had always been going on. There'd always been tough kids from homes in which there was less of a stronghold and guiding force for the children. I don't remember at that time hearing the term greasers. We called guys like that rocks. He was a rock. His hair was heavily petroleumed. The two sides met in the back, like a duck's posterior. And peg pants, narrow at the bottom. Their own style. In a sense, they were in the vanguard of fashion and other things. At least they were a rebellious force in a very unrebellious era. Unfortunately, some of them did social damage, but you know, certainly in style, and they thought differently than others, and not always constructively, of course.
What part did music play in all of that? What part did rock and roll? We have this image of of kids tuning in rock and roll in their bedrooms late at night, listening on radio because their parents are saying, you know, get that shit off. You know, it's a communist influence. Rock and roll. What did it mean?
Well, I remember the invention of the name, as a matter of fact. And I believe it happened in 1955. My father thought this would rot my brain. He said, what is that? There's no tune there. There's no nothing. You know, it's not like every little breeze seems to whisper Louise. He could understand that. Alan Freed, who had come from Cleveland and had done gospel shows, had a show called The Moondog Show. And Moondog, the famous New York blind Viking poet character, who had blind Viking poet groupies, by the way, very esoteric form of groupies, hard to find them. They only attach themselves to blind Viking poets. He threatened to sue Alan Freed because of the name. And then I remember that day, hey, boys and girls, we have a new name for this show, the Rock and Roll Party. Mostly they were groups. They were black groups or duos, Charlie and Ray, the Cadillacs, the Harp Tones, the Valentines, some of whom crossed over and secularized gospel music. And it became our thing. It became our parents didn't understand. They did not get into that till many, many years later when it was universal at a wedding when they'd play some rock and roll. I think parents feared it. When one looks now, at the objections to Elvis, for example, I was never a big fan of Elvis's, but Elvis the pelvis, you know, these gyrations and all. This was old hat in the black community, jitterbugging. Also, sexuality in dance was old hat even to whites. The tango, I mean, it's very, very sexual dance, very. But suddenly their children were doing it. As soon as it spreads to their children, when drugs went from some esoteric little problem in Harlem to their, then it became a problem. You know? It seems innocent now that should they allow Elvis to do that with his pelvis in public? You know, it was the last of the naive times, and except for that little bit of convention that today you can hear anything. Any comedian uses any word anytime he wants to. It kind of spoils it. Except for that little subtlety that was missing, that dance of avoidance until the right time comes when you're married. Except for that part that's missing. I don't miss that at all. It was a repression that was unnecessary. It caused endless guilt and unhappiness, and young women and young men feeling guilty about something they did which they couldn't help, you know.
Do you remember, how did rock and roll affect you personally? How did you respond to it? What did you grab onto? Did you gravitate towards it?
I loved it. I had a group called the Teen Tones, and the culmination of our career, we sang in the toilet in high school because of the echo. You know, we sounded like a recording studio in the boys' room at Dew Clinton High School. Anywhere else we sang, it sounded like we were singing in a toilet. But in the toilet, we sounded like a recording studio. We couldn't get any recording company executives to come and hear us. They didn't have toilet divisions to scout talent. We were on the Ted Mack Amateur Hour, which was a holdover from old Major Bowes shows in the 30s, which I never saw, but Ted Mack went around and had amateurs and put them on television. We sang, I want a Sunday, gonna you know, those kind of songs. And we were defeated by a one-armed pianist from Missouri who played a Mozart sonata for 4 hands. He was quite busy, but he wasn't that good.
Did you think that rock and roll was rebellious? I mean, did you grab onto it because you said, hey, they don't like this, so therefore?
I don't think that I liked it all the more because my parents didn't. I wanted my parents to like it, but it was an impossible task. In fact, I used to have daydreams about the Teen Tones playing the mountains, up in the Catskill Mountains, for regular grown-ups, and them going, ooh, hey, that's tough. That was our name for a pretty song. Oh, that's tough. You know? Not a shot. They insisted on melodies, and you know. Actually, we had melodies too. But you know, my father once had a breakthrough, I think, where he understood that when he was a kid, toilets ran next door. I'm an improviser. I can't help it. Listen, can you hold up urinating until we're finished here? This is PBS. My father had a sort of breakthrough once, as I recall, where he realized they had their fads too. When he was a young man, maybe a little older than 13, but oh, everything's upside down when the music goes round and round, ooh, and it comes out here. Well, I heard this, and he said, this was a wild song that we had when I was a kid, and I said, that's wild, you know. Boop, boop, be-doop. Every era had its own. Every era thinks it has its own. I must say, this was more significant than most because this more naive music of the 50s, rock and roll, led to some significant music, some of which is overrated in the 60s later on, but still opened up a whole avenue of a new kind of popular music. And some very talented people were attracted to it, poets and excellent musicians. And it also unabashedly brought to the population at large, meaning white people, what were basically African rhythms. You know, I saw old photos of movies of the Johnsons who went filming in Africa in the 20s. And they played jazz for these natives, these Africans. And it doesn't look at all different from dances today. They got right into it in a second because they fed it originally.
Can you talk to me for a second about...
I wanted to finish that one thought. Every era thinks it has, oh, their children are the most rebellious. You look at quotes from ancient Greece. I mean, the children are running wild. We have to do something about them. And also, every era thinks it has a foothold on morality. You know, oh, ball players today take cocaine. Well, you know, the Gas House Gang in the 30s in St. Louis Cardinals, never attended a game sober. You know. Their drug was liquid. You know.
In the days, you're talking about these films that are running now on MTV. This significant part, some of those films are going to be in our series, I'm sure. We've got the rules of dating and a date with your family, you know, when you sit down and how to conduct yourself properly at the table. But dating as a phenomenon in the 50s. The 50s were filled with rules on every possible conceivable means of living that you could have, from how you dealt with your parents to how you dealt with your dog. But do you remember dating? What was dating all about? Was it a painful experience?
It was very difficult. I mean, I had this burning desire to be around girls, to know them in every way possible. And then sadly went to an old boys' high school, which was murderous. First of all, I had a sister, not to mention a mother. And I always used as a kind of credo that I wouldn't want to, that's someone's sister that I'm trying to feel up, you know? So I had to keep that in mind. I wouldn't like someone to do that to my sister. There was the idea of marriage as the the ultimate goal, and that's when it's wide open. You know, I looked at my parents; they didn't look that wide open to me. You know what I mean? I was painfully shy. I felt that girls had all the cards. I didn't realize what weapons I had, that they wanted me just as much as I wanted them. And as far as these rules are concerned, they are ludicrous and appear ludicrous to us now. But rules and conventions keep a society intact. A rule in and of itself is not bad, or a convention, or courtesy, or politeness, or do unto others as you would like them to do unto you. These are not bad things automatically. I think they were brought to an absurd kind of, someone in the education system got this idea, oh, gee, let's use movies, because movie was always a treat in school. It was a great breakup. Oh, we're going to see a movie. So automatically they figured, so as did the armed services, that this will automatically solve all problems. You'll learn whatever you see in a movie. I thought it was carried to absurd lengths. And of course, even then, we knew that that was baloney. I think there was a snicker at every one of those things, even then. It was camp when it was brand new. It was just not the way life was.
But you know, you talk about rules being, you know, of course, rules are a part of society. Wasn't there a feeling, didn't you sense a feeling of hypocrisy regarding the rules in the 50s especially, that, you know, hey, you're telling me to do this and to do that, but I see you living your lives and, you know, as adults, kid to adult. A sense of hypocrisy, a sense that, you know, you're preaching one thing, but you're doing something else.
I perceived a sense of hypocrisy in the 60s. Because I got old enough to know what hypocrisy really was, and because the 60s were more symbolized by a throwing off of all these rules. In fact, that's probably what frightened grown-ups most. It looked like the society was kind of nihilistically destroying itself, or people were destroying it, and so there wouldn't be any rules. In the 50s, I don't think I could conceptualize hypocrisy. It really, what amounted to was guilt and pain. I knew I wanted to ravish this young woman, and I knew I shouldn't, and I couldn't figure that out. I assumed it must have been some base instinct. A lot of people report when they went to Catholic schools that was really in spades, that they got that message. Not being Catholic, I couldn't say that, but being Jewish, I could say that. I mean, it was, you were taught in a good home how to behave or not to behave. There was some winking. I mean, oh yeah, you like kissing that girl? I mean, spin the bottle at a party, you know. But that was it. And the girl, I thought that the young girls had it much tougher because the burden was on them to control these base urges and to control the urges for another party too, the boy. So I didn't perceive it as hypocritical yet. It was just, I want to, but I'm not supposed to. You know, and my body was telling me all kinds of things, you know.
Did you see, as the 50s started to wind down, and you were becoming, what, you were 18 years old when 1960 hit, or sometime around there, did you feel like things were going to break? Did you feel like the country was changing at all, that things were going to happen, that life as you knew it was going to be radically different, or if it wasn't, you were going to, you know, blow your brains out? Anyway, did you see seeds of the 60s, that what would become what we call the 60s happening to you, to the country personally?
I don't think in the very early 60s I did. I was busy in college from 58 to 62, rooting for the football team, had a girlfriend, told me she was not a virgin. And I didn't condemn her for it, but I remember feeling a little sad and loving her so much and thinking, doesn't matter, we'll go on. I mean, that was the last of my naivete with this lovely girl who had had a boyfriend before and had actually slept with him. Politically, Eisenhower was somnambulating years, which in light of recent administrations look kind of good, you know. I see the election of Kennedy as a trigger to a new optimism. First of all, everything was in show business terms. Don't forget, a very important element we're leaving out here is television, which ballooned in the 50s, became, I mean, my television, we purchased one in 51, it's been on ever since. And I was interested in imitating the comedians and all this. Kennedy was great looking, and he was young. A president was always a distant old fogey who you couldn't really relate to. And Kennedy changed that, and there was a sense, based a lot on media hype, of optimism, of great, wonderful things to come. Oh yes, we'll be strong against those Russians, but a new reasonableness and hipness, if you will. Here's a guy we can really relate to. And then he was killed, and that sort of triggered a new reality. One is always left to wonder, would we have gotten sucked into Vietnam had he lived? A lot of evidence presents itself to think that we would have. He, after all, was the first one to send the massive amount of American advisors and all that.
Well, I don't want to leave out television. I think television is very important. What was the message from television? What did you get from television?
Television was very, very reluctant to break out of its boundaries. I mean, television mirrored exactly what those training films did. Father Knows Best and Beaver and all these things, where the family life, first of all, it denied economic reality. Everyone in a sitcom had a beautiful suburban house, which was, after all, the dream of the troops coming home and get out of the city, go into the suburbs, get that little, used to be 40 acres and a mule, now it's, you know, a quarter of an acre and a porch. But everyone wanted it, and everyone in a sitcom had it. No one in a sitcom was urban or poor. I mean, very, very few instances. There were little brushes with ethnicity, Molly Goldberg. That soon disappeared too, largely because a lot of the cast was decimated by being blacklisted. That's a very important thing too, that a whole group of people were deprived of their livelihoods. It's another subject, but television was not at all revolutionary. You had certain visionaries like Edward R. Murrow or others that began to use television to bring home to people the stark visual reality of what was going on in the world in documentaries. But by and large, it was very, very fluff-oriented, and it just reflected what everyone pretended was the truth.